Have you ever wondered what makes a country developed or developing? We typically divide countries into two categories that are developed countries and developing countries. In these categories, developed countries are often referred to as first world countries, as they are self-sufficient nations. The economy of developed countries has highly progressed and possess great technological infrastructure as compared to other nations. According to the United Nations Report 2020, 35 nations are termed as developed. Australia, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, United States are among some of the developed countries. Developing countries, on the other hand, are countries that are still in the early stages of economic development, with low industrialization. They depend on developed countries for their establishment. These are classified as third world countries or lower developed countries. According to the United Nations in 2020, 126 countries were considered developing. Colombia, India, Kenya, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Thailand, and Nigeria are among some of the developing countries. However, it is challenging to figure out how to determine the differences between developed and developing countries. For example, United Nations divides countries into either as established or developed economies, transitional economies, and developing economies, as they represent the core economic characteristics of the country. On the other hand, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, considers several factors while determining the status of a country. Similarly, the World Bank divides countries into four categories: high-income economies, upper-middle-income economies, lower-middle-income economies, and low-income economies. Hence, even the experts cannot agree on a standard definition, as there are several factors involved. Now the question arises: what are the main factors that determine if a country is developed or developing? We will tell you about it in this video, along with some examples of different countries. Economists generally agree that both economic as well as non-economic factors, including human resources, natural resources, political freedom, and technology, are the main indicators that influence the economy as well as the development of the country. Governments in highly developed countries place a strong emphasis on these issues. On the basis of these indicators, gross domestic product, GDP, or gross national income, GNI, per capita, the level of industrialization, the overall standard of life, and the amount of technological infrastructure, i.e. Human Development Index, HDI, all are included in the factors that can be used to classify a country as a developed or developing nation. Now, you might have a few questions popping your mind, like what is GDP per capita? Or what does HDI mean? Let us explain it to you. Gross domestic product, or GDP, is a total market value of all finished goods and services produced within a country in a specific time. It includes all public and private consumption, investments, as well as foreign balance of trade. GDP per capita is a tally of all the goods and services in a country in 1 year by a person, as expressed in US dollars. The countries with highest per capita are the countries with unusual concentration of wealth. Although GDP is useful for acquiring insight about the world's economic powerhouses and dividing nations based on their economic status, we cannot entirely rely on this metric to distinguish between developed or developing country. For that matter, Human Development Index, HDI, is a measuring tool used by United Nations to assess the social and economic development levels of a country based on life expectancy, educational attainment, and gross national income, GNI. HDI places a higher emphasis on human development than the GDP. It considers a country's quality of life as well as its production capacity. This index is useful for examining the impact of policy choices made by each nation as well. It ranks the countries based on their development. There is no minimum requirement of HDI for a developed status. However, most of the developed countries have HDIs of 0.8 or higher. So, let's differentiate developed and developing countries in the light of these factors now. Developed countries typically share the following characteristics. Number 1, they have a high HDI, high per capita income and GDP as compared to developing countries. Number 2, the birth rate and death rates are stable. They do not have exceptionally high birth rates and infant mortality is low because of the quality medical care and high living standards. Number 3, They have better infrastructure, and the level of security is high because of advanced technology. Number 4. The unemployment rate is low as every citizen can get a job. Furthermore, the developed countries have a great number of career-oriented women. Number 5. Developed countries generate more revenue from industrial sector, and the level of exports is higher than the level of imports. Number 6. They have high standard of living, excellent communication and educational facilities, high child welfare, and medical facilities. Moving on to the developing countries. Number 1. They have low standard of living, low GDP, unequal distribution of income, and hence low HDI. Number 2. The mortality rate in developing countries is greater than the mortality rate in developed countries. Malnutrition to both mother and infants, which then results in a low life expectancy. Number 3. Unlike in developed countries, security in developing countries is still very minimal and inappropriate. Therefore, crime rates in developed countries are still relatively high. Number 4. Annual income in developing countries is not as high as in developed countries, due to the high unemployment rate. Number 5. Due to the low management of natural resources and human resources in developing countries more often buy goods from abroad. Number 6. The developing countries have less educational, transportation, communication, and medical facilities. There is unsustainable government debt and high level of poverty. Take an example of Australia. It is a developed country with the GDP 2019 $1,396.57 billion. Population 2019 25.36 million. GDP per capita 2019 55,057.2. HDI 2020 0.944. Australia has a high-income economy, which is world's 12th largest economy, 10th highest per capita income, and 8th highest human development index. It is regarded as a developed country because of its standard of living. It is a regional power and has the world's 13th highest military expenditure. Australia is one of the wealthiest countries in Asia-Pacific region, with a 20-year economic expansion. It has a high average life expectancy of about 85 years. As of 2019, the infant mortality rate of the country is 3 deaths per 1,000 lives. The inhabitants have the better quality of life, as they rate their happiness as 7.3 out of 10, which is higher than the global average of 6.4. Similarly, Germany is a developed country with the GDP 2019 $3,861.12 billion, population 2019 83.09 million, GDP per capita 2019 46,467.5, HDI 2020 0.947. Germany is Europe's strongest economy and the world's 4th largest economy. The country is well known for producing high-quality items like machinery, automobiles, electronics, as well as pharmaceuticals. In 2019, Germany had the world's largest and surplus economy in terms of imports and exports. It is the 4th largest shareholder of World Bank. It has a high GDP per capita as well as a high HDI. The country has an 81-year-old life expectancy as of 2019, with an infant mortality rate of only 3 deaths per 1,000 live births. Citizens of Germany have access to universal health care. Every German is required to join a not-for-profit medical fund that covers the cost of majority of the operations and prescriptions. Now if we look at Kenya, which is a developing country, it has GDP 2019 $98.84 billion, population 2020 53.77 million, GDP per capita 2020 $1,838.21, HDI 2020 0.601. Kenya is a country in Eastern Africa bordering the Indian Ocean. It is a developing country because it has less developed industrial base and a generally lower human development index. Its GDP when compared to other nations is lower too. As of 2016, 36.1% of its population lives below the international poverty line. Moreover, its key development challenges still include poverty, inequality, transparency and accountability, climate change, continued weak private sector investment, and the vulnerability of the economy to internal and external shocks. Now you might be thinking that, why isn't China considered a developed country yet? Let's find out. China has GDP 2019 $14.7 trillion, population 2019 1.4 billion, GDP per capita 2019 10,216, HDI 2020 0.761. Even though China seems to appear as developed, it is still classified as a developing country. This is due to the fact that the rates of poverty and unemployment are high in this region. Moreover, its GDP per capita is too low as compared to that of the developed countries. Similarly, China has an HDI of 0.76, which is less than the HDIs of a developed country, indicating that it is not one of the world's most evolved nation. Another factor that is often mentioned as a reason that China should still be considered a developing country is the fact that development in the country is incredibly uneven. For instance, much of China's economic growth is concentrated in the country's coastal areas. The interior provinces have seen much less growth and development, not to mention the fact that there is a very wide wealth gap between those who live in China's cities and those who continue to live in rural areas. Have a look at the comparison chart representing the differences between developed and developing countries for a better understanding. I hope we have cleared the concept of differences between developed and developing countries. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask us. We will be happy to answer them for you. If you found this video informative and enjoyed the content, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the like button as well. Thank you for watching.
According to the United Nations, it no longer judges a country by a particular stage that it is at in its development. Nonetheless, countries are ranked higher in terms of the comforts and opportunities afforded to its citizens. We now call this the Human Development Index. Back in the day, we would judge a country by its stage of industrialization, and the first developed country in this sense was the UK. Belgium followed, then Germany, then the USA, and then France and other Western European nations. If we look at today's Human Development Index, the top 10 countries in order are Norway, Australia, Switzerland, Germany, Denmark, Singapore, the Netherlands, Ireland, Iceland, Canada, and 10th, believe it or not, is the USA. The UK, which was once in first place, now stands in 16th place. Today we'll look at why. In this episode of the infographic show, third world versus first world countries, what's the difference? Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell button so that you can be part of our notification squad. First of all, many people think we should stop using these terms of first and third world. The terms are seen as insulting and vague, and while some nations might not be economic powerhouses, what's to say that citizens don't live a happy and safe life even without a Big Mac and fries? If we go back some years to 1952, a French demographer, Alfred Sauvy, wrote about 3 worlds, 1 planet. It is he who is said to have first coined the term. By first world, he meant the USA, Japan, South Korea, and Western Europe. By second world, he meant the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, and communist allies. At the bottom, in the third world, he meant all the rest, societies that were mostly agrarian and poor. One of the reasons the term is decried is because it was so vague. There wasn't really much analysis, and so in spite of northern Brits living in industrial slums and working in inhumane conditions, as George Orwell wrote in The Road to Wigan Pier, because of Britain's relative wealth, it was deemed first world. In fact, these days, a professor at Harvard Medical School has used the term fourth world, which includes the USA. This means a country of great wealth where some parts of society live on the fringes, jobless, often drug addicted, with no healthcare, and not so many opportunities to change things around. They are living in a first world with third world standards. So, this is a rather confusing question we have posed. Do we use the term developing? We can look at what has happened over many parts of Asia in the last 20 years. While parts of China, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand still have pervasive abject poverty, there is a lot more money. It isn't exactly getting to everyone though, and one might ask if farming rice in China was any worse than making iPhone components for hours on end in a factory in a polluted city. But with this new money, infrastructure has improved, and so too has healthcare and education. We could say these countries are verily developing, but why is Norway the most developed? Is it still not developing? Does developed mean stasis? Not really. All countries are still developing, but others could be said to be going through major changes. The US Department of State explains why Norway is so developed. Per capita, GDP is among the highest in the world, we are told, due to thriving industries in this nation of just 5.2 million people. Just take into account that Delhi has 18.6 million people. You only need to walk around Delhi to see poverty all around you. You don't have to go looking for it. India is developing due to its fairly amazing economic growth, but still it was reported in 2014 that 58% of the Indian population were living on less than $3.10 per day. India puts the poverty line at $1.90 a day. This may be enough not to starve to death, but we can imagine that those people living on that amount don't have the freedom and opportunities that Norway's less well-to-do people have. In fact, in Norway, the average income is more than $35,000 a year. Only 3% of the population work very long hours, and all Norwegians, according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, can expect good environment quality, jobs and earnings, income and wealth, education and skills, housing, work-life balance, civic engagement, social connections, and health status. The same definitely cannot be said of any developing nation. Nonetheless, anyone in India will tell you about great transformations, more job opportunities, and easing of poverty, and how far the country has come in terms of developing technology. Norway is top of the Human Development Index, so we could say this is the first of the first world countries, even though we don't use that term anymore. The top 51 nations fall in the high human development bracket. Out of 188 countries, India comes in at 131st. Indeed, India's super rich wealth and massive growth has yet to trickle down to many of the masses. The HDI has three main categories: environmental sustainability, economic sustainability, and social sustainability. Right at the bottom of the HDI is the Central African Republic. Again, while we don't use the term third world anymore, you could say that this might be the bottom of the list insofar as we have a term for not being developed. Why is that? For starters, life expectancy there is only 52 or thereabouts. It is tied with Angola and only better than one country, which is Sierra Leone. People there can expect to live to 50.1. By comparison, Norwegians on average can expect to live about 30 years longer. In India, the life expectancy is 68, somewhere in the middle. The 4.6 million people living in the Central African Republic have faced extreme poverty, war, ethnic and religious cleansing, and political violence. It's said to be the worst place in the world to be young, and even if you get a job, the average wage per year is said to be $400, although this might need updating. Half of the population is illiterate, and if you go to school, you might not do more than 4 or 5 years. It has one of the highest maternal mortality rates in the world, and about a quarter of the women have undergone genital mutilation. If that isn't bad enough, human rights hardly exist. Complain, and you might find yourself being arrested summarily and sent to a terrible jail. Corruption is rife, and there is not much anyone can do. The country has a history of labor rights violations as well as child labor. Children and women regularly face violence after being accused of being witches. One travel blogger talked of his experience in the capital of Bangui, saying it was a mess that is always teetering on the edge of violence. We are of course mentioning the very worst things, and no doubt a lot of people live a happy life there. We just want to outline a kind of first, second, and third comparison. That's why we picked these three nations. We could also look at the country of Botswana, which comes in 108th place. This is quite low, but if you've read Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers, you'll know it's home to possibly some of the happiest, laid-back, self-sufficient people in the world. Or was until recent times. According to Gladwell, they have a 2-hour workday on average and play around the rest of the time. They don't need iPhones or dinner sets made by Hermes. They are the last hunter-gatherer tribe called the Kung Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert. These wanderers also move through Angola, which is placed 150th on the HDI. Unfortunately, what they hunt and gather is being destroyed by development. Anthropologists say they get over conflicts in peaceful ways and generally are a happy lot. They provide for their kids with devotion and remain mostly monogamous. Wealth is shared with everyone. In more recent years, that has changed as some were forced to settle in one place, and that's when the problems arose. As soon as they got doors, they started shutting them and sharing less. They are also very much third world by Western standards. So, are they any worse off than an overworked, overweight, diabetes and hypertension suffering rich first world man that takes pills to sleep and often drinks to oblivion? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Also, be sure to check out our other video called What Can You Buy with $1 Million? Thanks for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time!
Humans have come a long way, from hunting our food, to growing it, to ordering it over the phone. Life has gotten easier and better for most of humanity, as we've built advanced societies with many people leading longer and healthier lives made even better by modern amenities. This process is called development. We often hear people divide up the world into developed and developing countries. But what do those labels mean? The best measure is to take the size of a country's economy, its gross domestic product or GDP, which is the total value of all goods and services, from crops to cars and from waiting tables to writing wills, that are traded or produced within the borders of a country over a period, normally a year, and then divided by the number of people that live there. This is called GDP per capita. Some countries with a large GDP have a large population, so their GDP per capita might be relatively low. On the other hand, some countries with a small GDP might have a small population, so their GDP per capita might be relatively high. Countries with high GDP per capita are considered richer and more developed. And countries with low GDP per capita are considered poorer and said to be developing. So why do some countries have higher GDP per capita than other countries? Well, every country is unique, but there are some important conditions that are required for countries to really grow and sustain healthy economies. First, there needs to be peace and stability. When people struggle to survive every day, it's nearly impossible for them to go to work regularly and earn a living. Second, populations need quality education. If people are able to read and do math, they are likely to be productive workers and savvy consumers. And increasing knowledge fosters innovation and helps spread new technology. Third, people need access to capital. Starting new businesses and establishing more advanced industries requires money, which can be accumulated domestically over time or sourced from abroad much more quickly. Fourth, countries need to establish the rule of law, where government officials operate by a written legal code, instead of corruptly helping themselves and the people they like and harming those they don't like. When the rule of law includes strong property rights, it spurs economic growth. People are more likely to start businesses and work hard when they are able to keep the money they earn, the things they build, and the ideas they invent. Fifth, there needs to be equality of opportunity. If governments eliminate discrimination against women and minorities, ensuring that businesses and the law treats all people equally, they can participate in the markets they want and can work in the jobs they're best suited for, unleashing their full economic potential. Many countries struggle to achieve these 5 preconditions for economic growth, but other countries frequently offer to step in and help by hosting peace negotiations, funding and supporting education programs, and offering cheap loans for infrastructure projects. But why would one country care about helping another country grow economically? Well, there's several reasons. Some governments value humanitarianism and simply view it as the right thing to do. We should all try to help our fellow humans no matter where they live. Countries can also help themselves by helping other countries. They can improve their own security. Poor countries are vulnerable to terrorists, pirates, and drug cartels. Those dangerous groups don't necessarily respect borders and often spread violence and conflict to other countries. But if a country has a growing economy, those violent groups are less likely to form, reducing the security threats for other countries. Another reason countries help other countries is to boost their own economies. If other countries are more prosperous, they can become more beneficial trade partners and can offer new investment opportunities. But development isn't just about economics. Since the 1980s, the concept of development has expanded to include humans' abilities to live their lives the way they want. Are people able to move freely without discrimination? Can they access modern healthcare and live in environments free of pollution? Do they have political equality and the freedom to speak their minds? The United Nations Development Program works to help countries improve, and it has incorporated this new understanding of development in its mission. Since 2016, the agency has been guided by the UN's 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, which not only target economic growth, but also aim to protect the environment, encourage democracy, and promote equality. Overall, the world has improved dramatically over the past 40 years. Extreme poverty has decreased by 75%. The number of students going to school has increased by nearly 50%, and the average income has quadrupled. But there are plenty of ways for the world to further develop and for every country to become a better place to live.
The Middle East and North Africa is sitting on a gold mine. Well, a black gold mine. Beneath this region is at least 113.2 billion metric tons of oil. And here the physical geography and the human geography kind of line up. The oil isn't uniformly distributed beneath the surface of the earth, and neither is this mind-boggling wealth. But the Middle East and North Africa region, often called MENA for short, knew great power and wealth even before oil became so valuable. At one point, the region housed some of the most powerful empires and most influential schools of thought, and yet not every country in the region is considered powerful today in 2022. In this series, we've highlighted how the perception of all places and lands isn't fixed. In geography, we like to tell the story of the world, but there are so many different perspectives and ways to know our experiences, we need to think carefully about what story to tell. And the way we tell those stories too. Geography has long been a tool wielded by empires. Knowledge about strategic locations, mineral resources, locations of political power, and even how we talk about and describe cultures and people guide the leaders and rulers of the world. And development, which is a polarizing, complicated word, can be the concept we lump all those factors into. We draw comparisons and talk about growth, but we can also ask what having wealth and power really means, and how and why they're distributed so unevenly around the world. Even how we talk about development tells a story in and of itself. I'm Alize Carrere, and this is Crash Course Geography. When people talk about how resources, wealth, or even politics are distributed around a country or region or the world, those metrics are often collapsed into one concept called development. And we tend to think of a word like development with a certain amount of permanence. Countries that are developed stay developed. But since talking about and comparing countries depends on our perceptions and opinions at a particular time, the history of the word itself can be really illuminating. Talking about how developed a place is something that started in the mid-20th century. But even if it wasn't widely used before this, it has ties to the language used within European colonialism. Like we talked about in our last episode, many European colonizers changed the cultural landscape of a place just with their word choice. They describe their colonies as backward compared to their modern or advanced home countries to justify taking resources from their colonies. Until the 1970s, development was largely thought of in economic terms, and a so-called developed country was one with standards of living and material wealth that looked like what was found in Europe and North America. They often had a history of industrialization and colonialism too. The other group of countries were originally seen as underdeveloped. These were places whose standards of living and wealth were considered not as good as the so-called developed countries. And it's probably no surprise to learn these countries often had been colonized by said developed countries. Eventually, underdeveloped changed to developing, and then got mixed up with talking about the third world. First, second, and third world are actually political terms that describe political leanings during the Cold War, coupled with a description of predominant economic models. But in most cases, those pairings don't make sense in a post-Cold War world. And underdeveloped, developing, and talking about the third world all came to mean the same thing to Westerners. That the non-white people of these places were inferior to people in so-called developed places. And it's a sentiment that grew out of the labels colonizers chose to use, and the history they devalued. But colonized people and scholars from around the world have pushed back on this narrative. They also pushed back on development being tied to how similar a place is economically and politically to the West, which is shorthand for Europe and North America. One way to more fully get at the nuance of development is to be specific about what type of development we're talking about. For instance, because economic standing and wealth and resources are what reinforced colonial narratives about who is developed, we still use economic metrics as one way to measure the economic development of a country. Some of the strongest economies in the world, maybe not surprisingly after those oil stats at the beginning, are places like the United Arab Emirates. It's one of the top 30 countries for 2020 gross domestic product, or GDP, which measures the monetary value of an economy's final goods and services, and is one way to measure the strength of an economy. The UAE has a free market economy, which we might remember dates back to some of the earliest histories and trade with both India and Mozambique thanks to monsoon migration. Those market-based policies, or policies that allow for supply and demand to set the value of a good, encourage competition and foreign investment. And from the late 1800s to the 1960s, it was under the control and protection of the British, which we know from our last episode on colonialism can have lingering negative effects, yet it's a strong economy thanks to oil and being able to use that profit to build infrastructure. Compare that to Lebanon, a location also endowed with resources, like a water surplus in an arid region, ample agricultural land, and its favorable location on the Mediterranean Sea, making it a key port for getting goods in and out of the Middle East. Lebanon was placed under French military administration after the First World War, and was part of the Ottoman Empire before that. Historically, Lebanon has been considered a wealthy place, but unlike the UAE, Lebanon has struggled to overcome the politics related to its colonial past and has had political and economic setback after setback. Remember, over the last few episodes, we've talked about different types of economic production and how it's not enough to have the stuff. Just owning natural resources doesn't make a country wealthy. Lebanon has water and agriculture, but in 2022, that doesn't equal the same wealth as massive oil fields. And even having oil fields doesn't guarantee wealth, and certainly not wealth for all people within a country. And if something is distributed unevenly, there's a geographer somewhere trying to understand why. As geographers, knowing that economic development is often what development is taken to indicate, we might also cringe at some of the latest iterations of terms. We might hear people talk about the global north versus the global south, or countries being more or less industrialized. How we talk about development is still evolving. But so far, we haven't come up with the best term. North and South say nothing about economic potential. And in the end, many of the countries that are considered economically developed today did so through tremendous extraction, either from their own resources or those of other countries. And the labels we use tell the story of those dominant countries. Those stories also guide the global response to how economically wealthy countries treat lower income ones. And there's a whole smorgasbord of policies meant to help countries create stable, free market economies and become economically developed. These can be things like import substitution, which are economic policies that attempt to make imports expensive through high tariffs or taxes on imported goods. The intent is to create economic motivation to create a strong secondary economy by manufacturing goods domestically. But many people involved in development are recognizing that to make an economy look like one in Europe and North America, it takes both economic and political infrastructures and a massive amount of wealth. Wealth that those regions built from colonial extraction that then funded their industrial revolutions, which is where the wealth of current low-income countries went in the first place. Instead, now low-income countries who are members of the UN often receive loans to fund these projects from the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and other supranational organizations, which mostly function outside of the authority of any one state. But these programs are not always a good fit, because if a country can't pay back what they owe, they default and have to work out a repayment deal, which usually involves restructuring their economy. And restructuring often involves some sort of austerity measures, like cuts to social programs like healthcare, education, and pensions. So a lot of the focus of development is on wealthy countries of the world helping other economies begin to look like they do. And in the process, a lot of those disparities just get reinforced when low-income countries are trapped in debt. But many scholars and leaders have pushed back over time. Because development doesn't have a universally accepted definition, that means we can also define it in ways beyond economics and how much like Europe they are. In shifting how we define development, we also shift the story. Post-colonialism, which is a response that gained increasing prominence throughout the 1970s and onwards, is in part a critique of the way these Eurocentric labels are produced and used. It's a framework that focuses on politics and activism in order to assert that formerly colonized peoples have a right to access resources and earn material wealth. In addition to reinforcing colonial stories, economically focused development also tends to reinforce a male-centered version of what we give value to. But societies that value traditional practices that are used to protect natural resources or traditional knowledge to minimize crises, or informal economic structures that provide mutual aid in a community might view development differently. These are all roles and knowledge traditionally managed by women, but are not often counted as economic development. We can also use other metrics beside GDP to measure development. Economists have pointed out that the traditional metrics can't measure quality of life or overall social and physical health of a society. And throughout the late 20th century, increasing emphasis was given to the Human Development Index, which is calculated by the United Nations. This is a compound index that looks at variables like access to safe water, birth rate, death rate, education, and access to healthcare to determine a country's level of development. For example, in 2019, the UAE had very high access to education and educational infrastructure, which gives it a high HDI score. It also has a high score for things that feed into economic infrastructure, like 100% of the population has access to electricity. But because so much of those metrics rely on funding infrastructure, Lebanon doesn't score quite as high. Another quality of life index is the Gender Inequality Index, which can show income disparity. For the UAE, men and women seem to have equal access to education and healthcare, but women make far less than men on average, and that's a trend throughout the region. But even these human-centered measurements tend to still point to an economic quality of life. There are also metrics for measuring environmental and socioeconomic sustainability, and even happiness. For instance, there's a gross national happiness measurement, which is an annual survey asking people about the overall quality of life they live. But each of these metrics pretty much highlights a single way of thinking and talking about the success of a given country. In the 2020s, development organizations are rethinking how they encourage economic growth in the Middle East and North Africa, a region with a large young population. And there's some effort to manage the region as an economic whole rather than several individual states. Internationally, countries like China are also rethinking foreign investment by investing directly into infrastructure in return for land for factories, thus eliminating the need for loans. Ultimately, we have to think more broadly about what it means to be developed. Remember, in order to score high on the economic measures of development, an economy has to produce and consume a lot of stuff, And it's been estimated that if all countries consumed resources in the same way as the United States, we'd need 4 Earths. As the globe deals with a climate crisis caused by industrial development and struggles to understand the lasting damage of colonialism, we will need to rethink what development is and how to access resources and commodities in an unequal world. And one area we can start with right now is remembering that ultimately, we need to put people first, both in deciding how we measure these sorts of things and how we implement the changes that are necessary. How we define development matters because it shapes the interactions that are allowable, where wealth gets located, and the global discourse on what is acceptable economic practice and what isn't. It shapes how we tell the story of the world and who are heroes and villains. Failing to see that there are multiple valid ways for a country to be developed can cause harm. And the stories we tell about ourselves and other countries can shape how we all relate to each other. Next time, we'll tell the story of growing cotton with genetically modified seeds in India and the unintended consequences of this development strategy. Many maps and borders represent modern geopolitical divisions that have often been decided without the consultation, permission, or recognition of the land's original inhabitants. Many geographical place names also don't reflect the indigenous or aboriginal peoples' languages. So we at Crash Course want to acknowledge these people's traditional and ongoing relationship with that land and all the physical and human geographical elements of it. We encourage you to learn about the history of the place you call home through resources like nativeland.ca and by engaging with your local indigenous and aboriginal nations through the websites and resources they provide. Thanks for watching this episode of Crash Course Geography, which is filmed at the Team Sandoval Pierce studio and was made with the help of all these nice people. If you want to help keep Crash Course free for everyone forever, you can join our community on Patreon.
This is Taiwan, a heavily disputed territory off the coast of mainland China that is home to 23.5 million people and some of the most important industrial centres in the world. Don't worry, this is not yet another video about Chinese and Taiwanese hostilities and how it could be the catalyst for a major war between global superpowers. It's instead about a trend that, while not as attention-grabbing, could be just as devastating for most of the world. Taiwan today is the second richest major economy in Asia, following only just behind Japan, which it should overtake in the next few years if current trends continue. It is clearly an advanced economy after making the transition from a poor agrarian makeshift settlement and a military dictatorship that only officially ended 35 years ago. Taiwan's story of transitioning from an agrarian economy to a low-cost manufacturing centre, and then finally on to becoming an advanced centre of world-leading industries is not unique. Other countries in the region followed very similar paths in the last decades of the 20th century. South Korea, Singapore, Japan, even certain regions within mainland China, all became what economists would broadly call advanced or developed economies. Taiwan is interesting because it really was one of the last major economies to make that jump. And today, more and more of the fast-growing economies from around the world are struggling to make the transition from a developing economy to an advanced economy. There are even examples like Brazil that arguably became the first country ever to go from being an advanced economy back to being a developing economy. Outside of unique situations like this one, the general trend is that less and less countries are making that final step to become fully fledged advanced economies and are getting stuck dealing with endless problems in the developing stage. Already this year, we have made videos about Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and even China that are all lurching from one economic problem to the next. Now, there are endless reasons as to why rich countries are rich and poor countries are poor, but one of the biggest ones is an economic process known as brain drain, which has the potential to solidify countries' positions in the global economy and make it almost impossible for anybody else to join the ranks of the 30 or so existing advanced economies. So, what is brain drain and why is it getting worse? How is brain drain making rich countries richer and poor countries poorer? And finally, is there any way for the developing countries to stop this from happening? This episode of Economics Explained was brought to you by Course Careers. As we're about to find out in this video, universities have become very expensive, but they are also not necessary for a lot of high-paying careers that favour practical and people skills over a formal education. Course Careers helps to bridge the gap by providing affordable online courses in technical industries that teach you everything that you need to know to do the job, instead of everything you need to know to pass a final exam. Course Careers also partners with a range of companies to make sure their courses are relevant and that their students will be in demand from the moment they complete their course. Their program already has hundreds of success stories, like Josh, who completed a course in technology sales while working part-time at Target and is now making $70,000 a year and is on track to be promoted into a six-figure role. Or Kyle, a former manufacturing plant worker who took the tech sales course 2 years ago and is now working as a regional sales manager making $150,000 a year. Often the only thing stopping people skilling into high-income roles that are in demand is the significant cost and commitment involved in getting that degree that they need to get through the door. Again, we are going to explore in this very video how expensive and competitive that's become, but Course Careers makes this easy. So to check out their other success stories and get $50 off the full course, go to coursecareers.com/economicsexplained and use the discount code EE50. The link and code are on screen now and in the video description below. There is no specific definition of what an advanced economy is or is not. Economists roughly agree that it's a country with a GDP per capita at least above $20,000 per year at the absolute minimum, a country with advanced and highly technical industries, a well-functioning and fairly regulated market system, and a good score on the Human Development Index. A combination of all of these factors is kind of important, and that's why institutions like the IMF would classify Spain as an advanced economy, but not Brunei, even though Brunei has had a GDP per capita 50% higher than that of Spain's. In fact, the IMF is really the only agency that specifically defines individual countries by labelling them as advanced, emerging, or low income, and you really have to go digging to find those classifications. To most economists, an advanced economy is one of those things where you know it when you see it, and I think it's important to mention that as we try to make sense of what is stopping other countries from reaching this ill-defined status. Brain drain is the process of highly educated and productive participants in an economy leaving their home country to pursue better opportunities in another country. This move can be motivated by better paying opportunities, a better lifestyle, or be driven by people leaving their home countries to avoid violence, corruption, or persecution. Overwhelmingly, the most productive members of economies around the world are moving from developing economies and moving to advanced economies. I am massively generalising here, but advanced economies are normally nicer places to live, with lower rates of violence and higher paying jobs. An engineer in India earns an average salary of 800,000 rupees, which is about $10,000 US. In India, that's actually a decent salary, but if they can take those expertise and get qualified as an engineer in the United States, they would potentially be earning 10 times that amount or more. An advanced country like the USA, while it has its problems, is also far less crowded and polluted than most areas of India. So, if it is an opportunity that is presented to them, a lot of people from India and a lot of other countries will take it. This hurts the countries they are coming from because they lose their most productive workers, the workers that will pay the most tax, produce the most value, and have the highest chances of driving innovation to make the country wealthier. They also lose these workers right as they stop being an economic burden, which I know is a very mean thing to say about children and students, but that's what they are. They take more money from the economy than they contribute until they go on to be workers. After their working careers, they once again become an economic burden in their old age. This is normally an investment worth making, either for the government or the children's families, because in undeveloped economies, children will go on to look after their parents while they can no longer work, and in developing and advanced economies, the children will go on to produce way more value in their working lives than the government lost to educating them and potentially losing out on their parents' taxable incomes while they looked after them. But the distinction of who pays and who benefits from children is different in these different economies. For undeveloped countries with little to no government welfare or support systems, individuals bearing the cost of having children is worth it because the children often directly work alongside their parents on farms or in businesses. Having children in these countries is also very cheap, so they are effectively making a low-cost workforce and a retirement plan all in one. Alongside other cultural factors, this is why most low-income economies have such young populations with so many children. For high-income countries, the cost-benefit of having children is reversed. Raising children is very expensive and often requires parents to leave the workforce for an extended period of time. There are also laws in most of these countries against using children for labour, even in family businesses, and there is no expectation that the children will financially support their parents in their old age because there are already alternative systems in place to do that. Because of this, almost every major and developing economy around the world today is dealing with some kind of demographic issue where their people are simply not having enough children to continue this cycle of young generations looking out for the elderly. If a majority of people get too old to work, it will put a significant strain on the few young people who still can, either directly as more and more of the workforce gets dedicated to looking after the elderly, or indirectly as young workers are forced to pay higher taxes to cover the costs of looking after an ageing population. This is already happening. The labour force participation rate in most countries is already falling as people are opting out of the workforce earlier than what economists assume. These figures also don't count for the growing population of people over the assumed working age that will require even more care. Low-income and developing countries are going to feel this effect the most because a high portion of their jobs involve physical labour that, unlike service-based jobs in offices, just can't be done by people that are too old or frail. High-income, advanced economies also have another advantage, which is why they stay rich. While low-income and developing economies only get the drawbacks of brain drain, which accelerates the problems they have with ageing populations, rich countries benefit from it by being the sink that those brains drain into, which is just terrible imagery, but you get what I'm saying here. Rich countries that are desirable destinations to live and work will get their pick of skilled young workers who want to move there to start a better life. Most advanced countries can pick how many skilled workers they want to enter their economy simply by increasing or decreasing the amount of skilled worker visas they give out. After the global pandemic and record unemployment rates combined with low labour force participation, a lot of governments are opening up to record numbers of skilled migrants. Not only will these workers help to fix all of the problems of an ageing population, they can also act as a form of economic stimulus. People moving to a new country will need to buy a lot of new stuff to get themselves established. New cars, new furniture, new phones and internet plans, and of course, a new house and everything that comes with it. Whether they are renting or buying, a skilled migrant will be bringing money from their home country into the host country to stimulate the domestic economy. One area where this is most apparent is in schooling. One of the primary paths to residency for most people moving from a low-income or developing economy into an advanced economy is through student visa programs. People that have completed a university degree in a developed country are more likely to be successful if they apply for a working visa after they graduate, because the host country will recognise their degree and be confident of the applicant's language skills and ability to be productive enough to at least pass university exams and assignments. University degrees in most schools in advanced economies are significantly more expensive for international students because there are no government pricing controls combined with lots of demand, so those students provide a great source of revenue to these centres of education. This is not without its problems. In my own home country of Australia, education is one of the largest exports we have. We receive more money from abroad to pay for university fees than we do for petroleum or natural gas. Because this is so lucrative, there has been a trend to make sure that international students get what they pay for no matter what, which is a university degree. This has caused multiple scandals where professors were pressured into passing poorly performing international students just to make sure that the university kept a good reputation for more international students in the future. This is not a problem by any means unique to Australia either, and universities around the world are going to struggle to balance the temptation of easy money from international students and their families, who are willing to pay almost anything for a free stepping stone into a life in an advanced economy, and academic integrity. International students also take the places of local students who might have wanted to attend a university but missed out because their grades weren't high enough to compete with their local cohort, as well as students from other countries. This wouldn't be such a big problem if it was totally fair, because nobody is owed a place in these schools. And if local students don't meet the standards of enrolment, they shouldn't be let in just because they were born in the same country the university operates in. But again, there have been multiple instances where international students that do make the cut arrive for their first semesters with little to no language skills and questionable academic performance. If students have been let in from abroad at the expense of local students just because they pay more money, then that is obviously a problem. These significant small-scale issues aside though, if we look at this process from a macroeconomic perspective, it's almost the perfect way to introduce skilled labour into an economy. The country receiving international students gets direct stimulus from abroad, which funds their research institutions. It also gets stimulus as those students need to pay for their everyday living expenses like housing, food and entertainment. A lot of countries' student visa programs will allow students to work part-time jobs while they're studying, but even still, most of the money to cover these expenses will be coming from their family or personal savings back at home. Even if they do take a part-time job, that can often help the host country because they will normally be working the unskilled and not particularly well-paid jobs that people don't care about missing out on. As soon as they graduate from university, if they then enter the workforce in the host country, they are starting out literally at the very beginning of their careers, so they are maximising the time that they can add value and pay taxes to a country that did not have to support them while they were children. This also ensures that advanced economies get the best and brightest workers to progress innovation to make sure that their industries are more advanced and competitive than any alternatives that come from developing economies that lose their most promising innovators. So if this is such a problem that is already stifling the growth of dozens of countries around the world, how can economists stop it? The simple fact is that advanced economies are almost always going to be more desirable places to live and work than developing economies. Not only because they offer higher incomes to workers, but also because they generally have lower levels of corruption, crime and pollution, while also having better access to healthcare, education and other public utilities. Again, of course, this is a generalisation. There are examples of certain developing economies that beat out certain advanced economies in these factors, but it generally holds true, and that's the first thing that can be done to at least slow brain drain. People will be less likely to move abroad if living conditions at home are good, so making sure a developing country is a good place to live is a very important factor in determining whether or not it will make it to become an advanced economy. Of course, getting rid of pollution, crime and corruption while providing better public services is much easier said than done, but it does highlight the importance of people, even in macroeconomics where the focus tends to be on big industries and trade deals. The other more direct approach countries can take is to invest heavily into industries that have the potential to make them advanced economies. South Korea, Japan and Taiwan, some of the most successful economies of the last 5 decades, all got started with strong government programs designed to build out world-leading technical industries in the country. This is distinct from low-cost manufacturing in places like China or India, and even from services in places like the Philippines. These are industries that are controlled by the greatest innovators, not the lowest bidders. Japan still designs and manufactures a lot of the world's most advanced electronic devices. South Korea is home to dozens of globally competitive companies, and by now I'm sure that you're all aware of just how important Taiwan's industries are to the global economy. Investment in these industries often involves paying lots of money to people so that they move to less desirable countries and provide their expertise for long enough to get the industry off the ground. It's also a risky endeavour with no guarantees of success, and it could just as easily take up a lot of government money that could have been spent on providing public services and getting rid of crime, corruption, pollution and all of the other things that made people want to look abroad for a better life to begin with. This subject was actually suggested by a commenter on a community post we made asking for video ideas. The team and I had been doing background research on brain drain and its effects on developing economies for a while because it was important to a lot of national economies that we'd explored over the past few months. But this comment was what made us decide that it probably needed a video all of its own, so if you have an economic topic that you think deserves a video, make sure to let us know. Thanks for watching, mate. Bye.